Before the flood, before the Bible, before recorded time, there were cities, machines, maps, gods, and monsters. All washed away, all denied, all still whispering through stone and silence. This isn't history, it's what history forgot. 53 mysteries carved into the ruins of a world we're not supposed to remember. So buckle in, because for the next 2 hours, we're not just digging through dirt, we're digging through time itself, and what we find might not be human. The origin of megalithic structures. It begins with a question that no one really wants to ask. Who moved the stones? Not metaphorically, literally. Who dragged, chiseled, placed, and aligned multi-ton slabs of granite, sandstone, and basalt with a precision that would make a modern engineer sweat through their OSHA compliance checklist? Across the globe, megalithic monuments rise from the earth like stubborn memories. Stonehenge, Gobekli Tepe, Humapunqueaq, one a riddle in rock. Cultures supposedly without the wheel, without metal tools, and in some cases, without writing, somehow became expert masons. They did not build to survive. They built to speak. To align with stars, to defy gravity, to echo something we've long forgotten. Gobekli Tepe is particularly obnoxious. It's not just older than Stonehenge, it's 7,000 years older. It was buried on purpose, as if someone wanted it hidden from the future. Or perhaps from the past. At Pumapunku, blocks weighing over 100 tons are cut so precisely that a modern laser cutter would blush, and then sulk. The stones interlock like ancient IKEA furniture, but with no margin for error. Some of them show drill marks. Others, 90-degree cuts in granite, harder than the tools supposedly available. Mainstream archaeology shrugs politely. Maybe they had ropes, maybe they had time, maybe they had aliens, but we don't like to say that part out loud. The deeper you look, the more arrogant our assumptions appear. These weren't just tombs or temples. They were instructions, broadcast in stone. Maybe about the stars, maybe about cataclysms, or maybe just about the futility of trying to explain anything without rewriting everything. And yet, the structures remain, immovable, incorruptible, as if time was the only thing they were built to defeat. And if the rocks can talk, what do they say about what came before? Something like this. You think we were the beginning. We were the end of the beginning. The next artifact will whisper something similar, but this time in gears and copper, not stone. The Antikythera mechanism. In 1901, sponge divers off the coast of Antikytheran Island, with no real ambition, pulled up a lump of bronze encrusted with centuries of salt and hubris. Inside that corroded mess was a machine that shouldn't exist. The Antikythera mechanism is, by every rational metric, a mechanical computer. A 2,000-year-old analog device capable of predicting eclipses, mapping the movements of planets, and calculating Olympic Games. It has 37 bronze gears, some toothed with microscopic precision, all predating any similar mechanical sophistication by over a millennium. So naturally, everyone assumed it was a fluke, a mistake, a one-off genius lost to time. That's easier than considering that the Greeks, the toga-wearing philosopher Shad, once built machines more complex than anything else seen until the 14th century. Some argue it was designed by Hipparchus, or Archimedes, or aliens. The safe answer, of course, is we don't know. But not knowing has never stopped the confident from filling in the blanks with mythology, mathematics, or museums. Because here's the real kicker. The mechanism wasn't made to last. Its parts are delicate. The inscriptions barely legible. It was meant to be read closely, used frequently. It was a tool, not a monument. And tools suggest a culture that used them repeatedly, efficiently, possibly even commercially. In other words, this wasn't a lone genius tinkering in a cave. It was a product. The tip of an iceberg we've decided to ignore. Ask yourself, what else did they make that didn't survive the water, the war, the rewriting of history? And what kind of civilization makes a calendar you need to wind? The next mystery crackles with a similar question. What do you plug into an ancient battery? The Baghdad battery. It looks like a middle school science project. A clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and possibly lemon juice. That's it. That's the Baghdad battery. Found in the ruins of what was once Parthian or Sassanid territory, no one agrees. Artifact has been dated to around 250 BCE, or earlier, or not at all. The point is, it shouldn't conduct electricity, but it does. When reassembled and filled with an acidic electrolyte, the jar produces a voltage, not enough to power a city, but enough to make a gold leaf twitch, or electrocute a priest, or electroplate a thin layer of metal onto another, that is if you believe it was ever used. Skeptics say it's a coincidence, or a container for sacred scrolls, or a badly interpreted incense holder, because saying battery opens a door we are deeply unprepared to walk through. If they had batteries, what were they powering? There are no ancient computers to charge, no Mesopotamian flashlights, no cuneiform iPods, just the uncomfortable silence of a possibility no one wants to explain. Unless you consider that the battery wasn't the tech but just the clue. An echo, a shard, a stubborn reminder that knowledge is not linear. It burns bright, and then it collapses. And if this was the leftover scrap of something greater, the real question is, what didn't survive? And if electricity flickered in the temples of forgotten empires, what else might have once lit up the ancient skies? Let's zoom way out into a mystery that only makes sense when you're 30,000 feet in the air. The Nazca lines. From above, they look like doodles from a bored god. Enormous geoglyphs scratched into the arid plains of southern paramonkeys, hummingbirds, spiders, straight lines that stretch for miles, and geometric shapes that spiral with a kind of obsessive compulsion. But from the ground, they are just scars. You can't see the spider unless you're flying. You can't even tell you're walking on something unless someone tells you. Which, of course, invites the obvious question, who were they talking to? The Nazca lines weren't meant for humans, at least, not humans on foot. They cover nearly 400 square miles. Some lines are up to 30 miles long, and they're old, not dusty museum, old, pre-Columbian old. They date back at least to 500 BCE, carved by removing the top layer of rust-colored pebbles to reveal the lighter ground beneath. It's not a complicated method. What's complicated is the why. The mainstream theory is ritual. Something about water. Something about pleasing the gods. A way to ask the sky to cry, which sounds poetic until you realize no one really knows. Some say the lines point to constellations. Others say they're astronomical calendars, trade routes, or the world's biggest prayer flags. And then there's the problem of visibility. You need elevation to appreciate them, but there are no mountains nearby, no cliffs, just the high desert and the wind. So how did they make them so precise? Enter the uncomfortable idea. Maybe the people who made them didn't need to climb up to see the lines because they already knew what they looked like from above. Cue the ancient astronaut crowd. They arrive right on time as always. Perhaps these were landing strips, markers, messages to beings in the sky. But if so, why draw monkeys? Why spiders? Why a giant with an owl face? And then again, maybe that's exactly the kind of thing you would draw to impress the sky. The truth is, we don't know who the Nazca were writing to. We only know they kept writing, quietly, massively, obsessively. Like people who feared being forgotten or who had already been remembered once before. Which leads perfectly to another map, drawn by human hands, but with knowledge that no human was supposed to have. The Piri Reis map. It's 1,513. An Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis finishes compiling a world map on a piece of gazelle skin parchment. It's a Frankenstein of older sources, some Greek, some Arabic, a bit of Columbus, a dash of who knows what. But one detail causes centuries of migraines. The map shows Antarctica. Not only that, it shows it without ice. Let's be clear. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820. And even then, it was considered an icy, useless afterthought. But the Piri Reis map not only places a landmass at the bottom of the globe, it outlines a coastline that seems disturbingly accurate. No ice cap, just bare rock and a detailed contour that modern sonar would later confirm, buried beneath thousands of years of glacial buildup. This map should not exist. Piri himself claims he based his work on much older charts, some dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, that would place the source materials over 1,800 years before his time. That's already bizarre. But the inclusion of Antarctica as a temperate, ice-free landmass? That suggests knowledge going back at least 6,000 years when, according to geological evidence, the continent may have had an ice-free coast. But who had that knowledge? No surviving culture, no surviving text. No other known map even hints at this kind of geographical heresy. Which leaves us with one uncomfortable implication. Someone had explored the world, all of it, long before we're told it was possible. Theories range from Atlantis to ancient seafaring empires to time travelers with really sloppy cartography protocols. Mainstream historians, predictably, roll their eyes. They argue that the landmass may have been a misinterpretation of South America. But this only explains the mistake if you ignore the accuracy. And it's always the accuracy that breaks the narrative, because mistakes can be dismissed, coincidences too. But detailed precision, that stinks of someone knowing something. And in the silence between the lines, there's an unsettling implication. The ancients didn't just know their world, they knew ours. Which brings us to a place where the ancient world lies sunken beneath the sea and may have been trying to show us that all along. The Yonaguni Monument. It sits underwater off the coast of Yonaguni, Japanangular, massive, monolithic, almost like a ziggurat collapsed into the sea. Divers call it the Yonaguni Monument. Geologists call it a natural formation, but those who've seen it up close tend to call it something else, impossible. At first glance, it looks carved, gigantic steps, perfect right angles, flat terraces that run like ancient highways beneath the Pacific. It's over 490 feet long, with layers that look too symmetrical to be the product of random tectonic tantrums. Some even claim to see tool-marked straight channels, staircases, and what might be inscriptions. But here's the kicker, it's underwater, which means if it is man-made, it predates the last ice age, at least 10,000 years old, maybe more. That puts it not just before the wheel, but before the wheel was even an idea. Mainstream geologists insist it's a fluke, a natural rock formation sheared by fault lines and current erosion. And yes, nature does have a knack for mimicking design. But mimicry doesn't usually come with symmetrical platforms, internal chambers, and what might be few squintancient carvings. The debate hinges on intent. Nature doesn't care about right angles, humans do. So who would have had the means to carve a city-sized monument out of solid stone and then lose it to the sea? Theories range from a forgotten Japanese civilization to lost continental shelf cultures to, you guessed it, remnants of Mu or Lemuria, a sunken continent, a wiped-out people, a memory beneath the waves. And maybe that's the scariest part. Not that we don't know what Yonaguni is, but that we might have known and forgot. Or worse, remembered and buried it on purpose. Because it raises a question that's hard to shake. What else lies beneath the sea, waiting for us to misinterpret it again? Time to dry off and turn inland to another mystery shaped like perfection, but carved by nature, or was it? The Moeraki boulders and Kutu boulders. Dotting the windswept beaches of New Zealand like giant forgotten marbles, the Moeraki and Kutu boulders look like they fell from a celestial child's pocket. They are nearly perfect spheres. Some cracked like ancient eggs, others smooth and seamless, weighing several tons, just lying there out of place, out of context, and absolutely refusing to explain themselves. The official story goes like this. They're concretion sedimentary rock that forms around a nucleus over millions of years, layering mineral deposits like geological pearls. A natural process. Common, even, just. Not this common, and not this perfect. Because that's what makes them unsettling. It's not their existence, it's their symmetry. The Moeraki boulders can reach up to 7 feet in diameter, the Kutu ones, even larger. And while erosion can do strange things, it usually favors chaos, not geometry. These aren't jagged or haphazard. They're spheres, with internal structures, hollow cores, fracture lines that resemble, if you're inclined to look at them the wrong way, panels or seams. To the local Maori, they are the remains of ancestral cargo gourds, calabashes, and eel baskets washed ashore from the wreck of a mythical canoe. To others, they're just weird rocks. To conspiracy theorists, they're fossilized energy nodes from a long-lost global power grid. Of course, what complicates things further is that they're not unique to New Zealand. Similar spherical stones have been found in Costa Rica, Bosnia, Mexico, and Kazakhstan. Different materials, same eerie shape. Are we really to believe that nature left to her own devices just happens to favor the shape of a mathematically ideal object with no structural advantage in the wild? Or is there a buried logic to the spheres? A language we're missing? A symmetry born of purpose, not chance? And if someone, somewhere, decided to make perfect stone spheres for reasons we can't begin to guess, what else did they make that didn't survive? Maybe they were tools. Maybe they were messages, or maybe they were warnings. Speaking of stone things that probably weren't supposed to glow, let's travel westward back in time and underground, where a temple wall may or may not hold the blueprint for ancient electric light. The Dendera light. Carved into the walls of the Temple of Hathor in Dendera, Egypt, is an image that looks hilariously modern, or rather, suspiciously modern. A figure holding a large oval object from which emerges a serpent, all contained in what seems like a glass bulb. Around it, supporting figures, mysterious cords, pedestal bases. To the uninitiated, it looks like a light bulb. To the initiated, it still looks like a light bulb. This carving has become Exhibit A in the ancient electricity court of fringe archaeology. They call it the Dendera light. Traditional Egyptologists scoff and wave it off. They claim the image represents the lotus flower spawning a serpent, a standard symbol of creation and rebirth. But that explanation, while culturally safe, requires you to squint pretty hard and ignore the coil-like shapes, the socket-looking base, and the fact that it really doesn't resemble a lotus unless that lotus was designed by General Electric. The temple itself is no slouch. Dendera is one of the best-preserved temple complexes in Egypt, and the chamber where the carving exists, it's deep, isolated, lacking natural light. Which opens the door, however, briefly for the tantalizing idea, what if they needed light to decorate those walls? And what if they had a way to make it? If so, where are the devices? Where's the infrastructure? Why did the knowledge vanish? That's always the catch with these theories. The carving looks like a light bulb, sure, but looking like something isn't the same as being that thing. We project. We overinterpret. Humans are pattern-matching machines with anxiety issues. Still, it's hard to shake the image, especially when placed alongside tales of ancient batteries, mysterious coils, and divine light in Egyptian rituals. Could it be symbolic? Of course. Could it also be literal, an artist's record of an actual device that we've forgotten how to interpret? That possibility is just plausible enough to be impossible to disprove. And that's the game, isn't it? A picture says 1,000 words, none of which come with footnotes. But let's say for a moment that ancient people did witness things they couldn't explain: technology, beings, creatures, and tried to preserve them in art. What happens when they take it even further? Let's head to Mexico, where clay figurines may have recorded an ancient history that makes our textbooks twitch. The Acambaro figures. In 1944, a German immigrant named Waldemar Julsrud allegedly stumbled upon something that should not exist again and again and again. Near the base of El Toro Mountain in Acambaro, Mexico, he began unearthing thousands soft ceramic figurines, strange ones, dinosaurs, humans, horses, bearded figures that looked suspiciously Asian or Egyptian. Some were riding the dinosaurs, others were simply hanging out, like prehistoric roommates. In the end, over 30,000 of these figures were reportedly found, all from a site with no clear stratigraphy, no carbon dating consensus, and zero desire from mainstream science to get involved. The figures are anachronistic in the most delicious way. Dinosaurs and humans? Together? That's not just unscientific, it's heretical. It threatens the entire structure of evolutionary timelines, paleontology, and archaeology all in one go. So, predictably, the academic response was nuclear. Hoax, they cried. Modern forgeries made to con a gullible collector. Locals were paid to sculpt fake relics and bury them for him to find. Case closed. Except, not quite. Some early thermoluminescence tests suggested the objects were ancient. Later tests contradicted this. Then the arguments shifted. Even if the artifacts are old, they must have been reburied. Someone planted them. A scam of staggering effort for absolutely no gain. Unless, of course, the motive was never financial but historical subversion. The figurines themselves are wildly inconsistent. Some resemble creatures straight out of the Jurassic Park prop department. Others look like cultural mashups from across the ancient world. The lack of stylistic unity either proves forgery or the Oppositian archive from a culture we know absolutely nothing about. But what if they're neither ancient nor fake? What if they're remembered? A culture echoing stories passed down for millennia, oral histories about beasts and men sharing the earth before some great flood reset the stage. And that's the recurring whisper in all these mysteries. The idea that something came before us, and we are the unreliable narrators of our own beginnings. Which makes the next claim all the more audacious. What if someone built a pyramid in Europe and erased the manual? The Bosnian pyramids. It started in 2005 with a hill. Just a hill. A pyramid-shaped hill in Visoko, Bosnia, with trees on its back and the kind of sleepy, indifferent charm that attracts neither tourists nor trouble. Until someone decided to start digging. What they found or claimed to find ignited one of the most contentious archaeological disputes of the century. Dr. Samir Osmanagic, a Bosnian-American archaeologist/enthusiast, declared that the hill wasn't a hill at all, it was a pyramid. The Pyramid of the Sun, to be exact. One of 5 such alleged structures in the Visoko Valley. Bigger than Giza, older than Giza, aligned astronomically, covered in geometric stone slabs. And beneath it, a labyrinth of underground tunnels, chambers, and mysterious megaliths that seem a little too carefully placed for comfort. Naturally, the academic world screamed. Fraud, pseudoscience, nationalist myth-making, a conspiracy wrapped in tourist dollars. Leading archaeologists wrote open letters condemning the excavation as destructive and delusional. They called it a hoax. And yet, the digging continued. The pyramids remain, massive, angular, and inconvenient. Their sides do form nearly perfect triangles. The layers of stone do seem deliberate. The tunnels do exist, kilometers of them, lined with sandstone blocks and artifacts of ambiguous origin. Visitors report strange energy fields. Locals talk of healing properties. Others whisper about buried secrets and suppressed history. So who's lying? If the Bosnian pyramids are real, they rewrite everything. Europe becomes the cradle of civilization. The timeline shifts by thousands of years. And the tools used to shape these hills vanish conveniently into history's black hole. If they're fake, it's one of the most elaborate, sustained hoaxes ever committed, complete with volunteers, engineers, and esoteric researchers all united in passionate delusion. Or maybe they're both. A natural hill, yes, but modified, enhanced, used. Just like many of the world's sacred, mountain-shaped, not by aliens or ancients, but by something in between, people who remembered more than we do. The stone blocks don't care what we believe, but the implications might. Next, we head even further off the coast and underwater again, where another rocky enigma dares us to tell the difference between nature, myth, and infrastructure. The Bimini Road. Just off the coast of Bimini Island, in the Bahamas, lies a path that seems carved not by tides, but by intention. It's called the Bimini Road, a half-mile-long formation of flat, rectangular limestone blocks lying in a suspiciously organized line beneath shallow turquoise water. From above, it looks like a submerged causeway, massive stones laid side by side, each roughly the size of a small car, fitting together with eerie precision. A road to nowhere. Or maybe from somewhere long forgotten. Mainstream geologists classify it as a natural formation, beach rock, they say, a coastal process, fractured by stress, rearranged by waves, perfectly explainable, case closed. Except, not quite. The blocks are too aligned, too regular, too rectangular. Some sections even curve, suggesting corners. Others stack, as if someone tried to terrace the sea floor. Divers claim to see tool marks, jointing, deliberate placement. And then there's the myth. Edgar Cayce, the famed American sleeping prophet, predicted that Atlantis would rise near Bimini in the 1960s. Conveniently, the Bimini Road was discovered in 1968. Timing so precise it makes skeptics sweat. If the formation is man-made, then who built I-Y underwater? Theories bloom like coral. Some say it was once a harbor or seawall, others a ceremonial road, a landing platform for, well, you know. The most poetic theory is, of course, the least provable. It's a remnant of Atlantis, or a civilization that shared its fate. There's also the uncomfortable fact that no tools, no structures, no skeletons have been found near the site, just rocks. Beautiful, suggestive rocks that refuse to commit to either category natural or man-made. The truth may lie in how little we understand ancient coastal geography. Sea levels have risen dramatically since the end of the last ice age. Entire civilizations could lie beneath the water, scrubbed clean by time, tectonics, and tides. The Bimini Road may be all that remains of a shoreline city drowned too slowly for myth and too fast for history. Or it might just be rocks that look like a road placed there by nature and walked on by our need for mystery. Either way, the pattern continues. And now, we follow the river that once flowed through legend until it didn't. The Saraswati River. It's mentioned in the Vedas, revered in the Rig Veda as a mighty, sacred river greater than the Ganges, holier than the Indus. The Saraswati was no metaphor. It had cities on its banks, temples in its shallows, civilizations in its shadow, and then, at some point, it simply vanished. Disappeared. For centuries, scholars thought the Saraswati was just symbolic, a divine idea, not a real river, until satellite imagery said otherwise. Beneath the dry plains of northwestern India and Pakistan, ancient riverbeds run like fossil veins, deep, wide, braided, massive, matching the descriptions in sacred texts perfectly. Hydrologists confirm it. There was once a major river system flowing through what is now the Thar Desert. It connected the Himalayas to the sea, and then between tectonic shifts and climate change it dried up. By around 1900 BCE, It was gone, and with it, perhaps, an entire civilization. This isn't a minor footnote. The Saraswati wasn't just a river, it was the center of early Vedic life. Towns, granaries, complex urban planning, all along a river that history forgot. It challenges the notion that the Indus Valley civilization was centered only around the Indus. Maybe it was really the Saraswati civilization. And maybe it collapsed not from invasion, but from drought and displacement. Which raises a more troubling possibility. How many mysterious disappearances of ancient cultures are actually climate stories? Not lost cities swallowed by the earth, but thirsted out of existence. There's also the symbolic angle. The Saraswati is often associated with wisdom and knowledge. So, when the river dried, was it just water that was lost or memory itself? And yet, despite all this, the Saraswati is still honored today. Rituals are performed for a river that technically doesn't exist, but perhaps it does, in subterranean trickles, in buried aquifers, in the minds of those who remember. Some rivers dry, others just hide. And now, from something that vanished through thirst, we moved to something that burned so hot, it left behind glassified scars, something that may or may not have been a fortress, or a bomb test, or a mistake the past tried very hard to forget. The vitrified forts. They dot the landscapes of Scotland, Ireland, and parts of mainland Europe. Ancient stone fortresses perched on hills and cliffs, their walls scarred by a process that modern science still doesn't fully understand. Vitrification. In simpler terms, these walls have been melted. Literally. Stone fused by heat, so intense, it turned parts of the ramparts into glass. Some of these structures date back to the Iron Age. Others, possibly earlier. Dunmac Sniachin, Tapa Noth, Craig Fadrigday stand half crumbled, their battlements glistening with the unmistakable sheen of stone pushed past its melting point. That kind of heat doesn't happen by accident. We're talking temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. And not just for a moment. It would have required sustained heat over long periods, covering large areas. So the question becomes both obvious and unnerving. Who did this and why? Theories line up, each shakier than the last. Was it war? Maybe the defenders set fire to their own forts to prevent capture, or attackers ignited them to leave nothing behind. But if so, why only in specific regions? And why go to the insane effort of sustaining heat high enough to melt granite when simple fire and bloodshed would do? Others speculate it was ceremonial, that maybe vitrification was some sort of ritual sealing of the fort and offering to gods now as forgotten as the technique itself. A few go further, suggesting it wasn't primitive fire at all, but technology, lost knowledge, directed energy, ancient plasma weaponry. Or, in the far fringe, evidence of some prehistoric nuclear incident? No conclusive evidence supports any of it, which is precisely what makes it worse. Modern experiments have tried to replicate the process. They've managed partial vitrification under controlled conditions, using bellows, charcoal, and enormous effort. But nothing on the scale or precision found in these ancient ruins. We're missing something, some key ingredient, method, or intention that renders every experiment a shadow of the original. What remains are ruins, half glass, half story. The result of heat applied where it shouldn't have been possible, to structures that still refuse to tell us whether they were being destroyed or activated. And now, we leave behind melted fortresses and step into the quiet, staring faces of an even more enigmatic civilization known that carved heads the size of cars and vanished as mysteriously as it arrived. The Olmec colossal heads. They weigh up to 40 tons, stand over 9 feet tall, carved from basalt so hard it would take modern tools weeks to shape, and yet here they are, 17 massive heads scattered across Veracruz and Tabasco in Mexico, staring blankly into the jungle, with expressions that seem more knowing than benign. These are the colossal heads of the Olmec civilization, and they are not subtle. We know frustratingly little about the Olmecs. They're often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, predating the Maya and the Aztec, and laying down the ideological scaffolding for both. But their language? Lost. Their writing? Undeciphered. Their rise? Sudden. Their disappearance? Total. And those heads? They weren't left behind in temples. They weren't placed to intimidate enemies. Most were buried. Deliberately. As if hidden or preserved. Or both. Theories swarm like flies. Some claim they're portraits of rulers. Others say warriors. A few fringe voices argue they depict visitors from distant lands, specifically Africa, based on their facial features. That claim is controversial, of course, but the controversy itself underscores the core problem. These heads don't fit, not stylistically, not contextually, and certainly not logistically. The stone used for these monoliths was quarried miles away some, over 50 miles. Transported without wheels, without pack animals, through jungle and swamp, then carved with tools that should have dulled before a single cheekbone was shaped. And still, the faces are distinct, individual, almost humanly tired, like statues from an empire that knew it wouldn't survive. What we do know is that the Olmecs were astronomers, engineers, artists with a taste for the monumental and the cryptic. Their art features jaguar men, were serpents, and mythic motifs that defy standard classification. They played ritual ball games in courts aligned to celestial events. They built ceremonial centers so advanced, they're only now being reappraised by LiDAR scans and satellite imaging. And then, nothing. The cities faded. The people dispersed. The heads remained. The mystery isn't just the heads themselves, it's the silence surrounding them. A void in the historical record that's so loud it practically screams. But speaking of screaminglets, look at something even more bizarre. Skulls. Crystal clear ones. Some say fakes, others faded. Either way, they don't blink. And they don't go away. The crystal skulls. They gleam like artifacts from a science fiction museum. Human skulls, intricately carved from solid quartz crystal, impossibly detailed and hauntingly precise. The most famous is the Mitchell Hedges skull, allegedly discovered in the 1920s in a ruined Mayan temple. Except, of course, that's probably not true. The story shifts depending on who's telling it, but the object exists, as do over a dozen others, scattered across private collections and museum basements. What makes them mysterious isn't just their eerie perfection, it's the claim that many of them were made in the pre-Columbian era. With what tools? Quartz is harder than steel. Carving it without cracking it requires delicate, high-frequency rotary tools. Any slip, and you're left with dust. Experts from the British Museum and the Smithsonian have run tests on several skulls. The results aren't pretty for the believers. Modern tool marks, rotary wheels, evidence of recent manufacture, 19th or even 20th century. In short, forgeries. Elaborate, convincing, but forgeries nonetheless. So, mystery solved? Not exactly. Because here's the catch. Not all skulls have been tested, and some have anomalies that don't fit any clear profile. Lack of tool marks. Polishing techniques that remain unclear. One skull, allegedly, has optical properties that allow light to travel from the base to the eye sockets in a way that's inconveniently advanced. Then there's the lore. Stories swirl around the skulls like mistales of healing powers, telepathy, and prophecy. That if all 13 of the true skulls are reunited, ancient knowledge will be revealed. Or humanity will be saved. Or maybe just vaporized. The legends are impressively flexible. Mainstream historians dismiss this as New Age fluff. And they're probably right. But the persistence of the myth and the effort put into faking these objects tells you something deeper. People want them to be real. Desperately. Why? Maybe because crystal doesn't rot, doesn't rust. It's clear, unblinking, and death-shaped. A symbol of permanence in a world obsessed with erasure. And maybe, just maybe, one or two of them slipped through the cracks of time, untouched by modern fraud, carried from a culture so forgotten, it doesn't even count as ancient anymore. Either way, the skulls keep watching. And the next artifact? It's even older. And, supposedly, much harder to explain because it should have crumbled long before we were born. The London Hammer. Discovered in 1936 near London, Texas not the foggy British one, but the dusty, sweltering American version, the so-called London Hammer, sits at the uncomfortable crossroads of geology and forbidden archaeology. It looks innocent enough, an old hammerhead, encased in a nodule of hardened rock, a wooden handle, partially mineralized, an iron head that's unusually pure. That's it. That's the entire problem. The surrounding rock is alleged to be 100 million years old, give or take a few million. Which would mean if the hammer is not a modern intrusion that some kind of tool-wielding intelligence was swinging hammers while dinosaurs still roamed the earth. Not exactly a minor typo in our evolutionary timeline. Of course, geologists are quick to dismiss the claim. They argue that the rock formation isn't truly ancient. It's a concretion, a natural sedimentary clump that forms around foreign objects over time. And yes, such formations can happen surprisingly fast, especially under the right mineral conditions. So the hammer isn't a 100 million year old anachronism, it's just a misplaced 19th century tool. Except the details don't quite sit comfortably. The wood shows signs of petrification. The iron head has an unusual composition, 96% iron, 2% chlorine, 1% sulfur and an absence of detectable modern alloys. It also shows no signs of rusting, despite decades of exposure and its claimed geological age. Which begs the question, was this hammer a freak of preservation, or a preserved freak? More troubling is what it represents. Not just a hammer in stone, but a metaphorical hammer, smashing against the glass box of scientific comfort zones. Because if it's real, if it really did get sealed inside Cretaceous Stratothin, every human timeline falls apart like a cheap wristwatch. But maybe that's the beauty of it. A simple tool, trapped in ancient stone, asking a question no one wants to answer. What if we're not the first? Let's lean into that discomfort. Because if you think the hammer's bad, the next artifact is even weirder. It looks like a spark plug. It came out of a rock, and it might be even older. The Coso artifact. In 1961, 3 rock collectors hunting for geodes near Olancha, California, cracked open what they thought was just another nodule. What they found inside wasn't quartz or crystal but a piece of metal. Cylindrical, symmetrical, threaded, and wrapped in what looked suspiciously like ceramic or porcelain insulation. It bore a striking resemblance to, you guessed it, a spark plug. Now, spark plugs don't belong inside rocks, especially not rocks estimated to be at least 500,000 years old. That's the claim made by the discoverers of the so-called Coso artifact. It was quickly seized upon by fringe theorists, ancient astronaut enthusiasts, and fans of historical heresy everywhere. Mainstream science, as usual, groaned audibly. A later analysis suggested it might be a 1920s-era Champion spark plug, likely from a Model T Ford. Which would be entirely mundane if not for the fact that the artifact was allegedly embedded in a geode-like concretion, not just loosely encased, but fused in such a way that dislodging it would require cutting through mineral deposits, not something a discarded car part does on its own. And once again, the explanation hinges on time. Geodes and nodules can form in decades under certain chemical conditions. Or they can take thousands of years. Depends on who you ask and what answer you want. The Coso artifact vanished from public scrutiny for years, adding to its legend. No further tests, no independent verification. Just fuzzy photos, conflicting testimonies, and the faint scent of either conspiracy or embarrassment, or both. So let's consider the impossible, that it is a spark plug. From 500,000 years ago, what does that mean? That someone or something was driving combustion engine vehicles in the Pleistocene epoch? That advanced technology rises and falls in cycles we barely register? That our past is not a line, but a spiral? Or maybe the artifact is a joke that reality played on you, Sand. We still haven't gotten it. In either case, the next object makes the Coso artifact look almost quaint. It's not just embedded in rock, it is the rock. A system of pipes, metallic and ancient, found in the middle of nowhere, where nothing should have been. And yet, there they are, the Baigong pipes. In the desolate emptiness of China's Qinghai province, near the shores of Lake Tosan, rises a mountain that no one would care about if it weren't pierced by ancient, rust-colored pipes. They protrude from the rock face, some running deep into the earth, others leading toward the lake. The site is known as Baigong Mountain, and its so-called pipes have become one of the most peculiar archaeological footnotes in the world. Some of the pipes are as wide as a human arm. Others are thinner, branching through the stone like veins. When analyzed, they were found to contain iron oxide and other trace minerals, along with a healthy portion of silicon dioxide. Some samples showed up to 30% unknown organic matter, which is not the kind of recipe you expect from an industrial pipe, let alone one allegedly thousands of years old. Mainstream scientists suggest the pipes are a natural phenomenon, fossilized tree roots, they say, or mineral veins shaped by groundwater leaching, a case of pareidolia seeing purpose where there is none. But this isn't a single pipe, this is a network, and the arrangement suggests engineering or at least intentionality, not random deposits, but directional flow, infrastructure. The pipes penetrate solid rock. Some run vertically, others diagonally. One of the most unsettling details? The site appears aligned with what some claim was once an ancient pyramid-like structure, a hollowed-out cave formation with a triangular entrance, now partially collapsed. Naturally, theories spiral. Extraterrestrials, lost civilizations, prehistoric mining operations, an ancient geothermal plant. Even the Chinese government seemed intrigued, sending researchers in the early 2000s, only to pull back shortly after with inconclusive statements and tightened access. Which leads to a more disturbing thought. What if they don't know what the pipes are? What if no one does? So we're left with rusted conduits, fossilized into silence, threading their way through forgotten stone, not screaming their origin, just waiting, like everything else on this list, to be misinterpreted again. And from these buried pipes, we move to something that doesn't hide at all. In fact, it proudly sings of the stars claimed not by machines, but by people who say they learned it. From beings not of this earth. The Dogon tribe's astronomical knowledge. Tucked away in the arid cliffs of Mali, the Dogon people live as if untouched by time. Their traditions run deep, their ceremonies are elaborate. Their masks, their stories, their rituals, they all seem ancient. And then there's their cosmology. That's where things go sideways. The Dogon, according to decades of anthropological research, have long held knowledge of the Sirius star system that they should not, by any reasonable measure, possess. They speak of Sirius A, the brightest star in our night sky, and of Sirius B, its dense, invisible companion. A white dwarf star so small and so heavy that even modern telescopes struggle to spot it. They describe its orbit, its 50-year cycle. They describe it as the heaviest thing in the universe. All of this, without telescopes, without writing, without contact at least, not modern contact. This was first reported in the 1930s by French anthropologists Grial and Dieterlen, who spent years with the Dogon and claimed they were taught these astronomical truths by tribal priests. The priests said the knowledge came from the Namo-amphibious beings who descended from the sky in a vessel that spun and roared like fire. Not gods, not animals, something in between, or maybe neither. So of course, the academic community had a fit. Critics say the Dogon were contaminated with modern knowledge by the very researchers studying them. That the anthropologists projected their own ideas onto the tribe's myths. That everything, like always, was misinterpretation wrapped in wishful thinking. But that doesn't erase the precision. The Dogon were right about Sirius B's orbit, right about its density, right about things they had no tools to measure. Even if the original observations were flawed, someone knew something. And that someone might not have been from here. But maybe this wasn't just a one-off encounter. Maybe knowledge was seeded, and fragments remain in monuments, in myths, in math. Because the next mystery isn't about stargazers, it's about stone layers. People who built not to look up, but to defy the earth itself, with a precision we still can't explain. The Great Pyramid of Giza's construction. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the punchline of every ancient mystery, the centerpiece of every fringe documentary, and the silent judge of every modern engineering project that claims to be impressive. And why not? It's 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing up to 80 tons, arranged so precisely that modern masons start to sweat just thinking about it. It's aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. The base is almost a perfect square, differing by less than an inch across sides. The joints between the stones are so tight that not even a razor blade can slip through. It's taller than most office buildings and more enduring than most nations. All built supposedly around 2560 BCE by farmers, seasonal laborers, and a massive national workforce fueled by bread and beer. That's the official story, but the math doesn't love it. The logistics are staggering. One block placed every 2.5 minutes, every day, for 20 years straight without modern cranes, lasers, or machinery. The stones came from quarries miles away. Some were granite, sourced from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers to the south. They weren't just stacked, they were placed, intentionally, with resonant chambers, ventilation shafts pointing to specific stars, and mathematical ratios that somehow align with planetary constants, pi, and the golden ratio. So either ancient Egyptians were Stone Age supercomputers, or we're missing something. Theories abound. Ramps? Possibly. But no definitive ramp system has ever been found. Internal spiral lifts? Maybe. Lost tools? Alien contractors? Pick your poison. Even if humans built Ithao, did they keep it so precise? Over 13 acres of surface area, with hardly a deviation. Did they just eyeball it? Were they guided? Or did they inherit the design? Because that's the unspeakable suggestion that the pyramids weren't the beginning of civilization, but a hand-me-down from something older. A memory in limestone. A monument to knowledge we no longer understand. And speaking of stone enigmas and weathered timelines, what if the face of Egypt is lying to us about its age? The Sphinx's age. It stares eastward, stone-faced and enigmatic, as the sun rises over the desert. The great Sphinx of Giza, half lion, half pharaoh, all mystery. It's supposed to be about 4,500 years old, carved during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, whose face it allegedly wears. But there's a problem with that story. Actually, several. For starters, the Sphinx is disproportionately small compared to the pyramids beside it. The head is too small for the body, suggesting it was recarved, modified, altered from something older. Its erosion patterns don't match the rest of the Giza plateau. Instead of wind-swept grit lines, the Sphinx bears vertical grooves, water erosion. But the Sahara hasn't seen sustained rainfall in over 8,000 years, which implies the Sphinx was carved at, least in part long before the dynastic Egyptians came into power. Maybe before they existed. Which means someone, some culture, carved this monument when the Nile Valley was a savanna. Mainstream Egyptologists resist this conclusion like cats to bathtubs. They argue that erosion could come from occasional flash floods or centuries of humidity. But geologists like Robert Schoch have thrown down the gauntlet, claiming the erosion is consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy rain. That would place the original Sphinx somewhere around 10,000 BCE. And if that's true, it doesn't just rewrite history, it shreds it. Who carved it? What face did it originally bear? Was it always a lion, a jackal, a hybrid god? And why place it to watch the sun rise over the spring equinox, something you only notice if you've been watching the skies for generations? Perhaps the Sphinx wasn't meant as a tribute to a king, but as a warning, a memory set in stone before the sands reclaimed it. A survivor from a time when the stars mattered more than kings, and monuments were meant to outlast memory itself. Whatever it once was, it still watches. And next, so does something else. A jar, a cylinder, a rod. One spark away from setting our entire understanding of ancient energy ablaze. Again. The Baghdad Battery, revisited. Yes, we've seen it before: a clay jar, a copper tube, an iron rod, and the same maddening question: what were they powering? But now we revisit the Baghdad Battery not just as a quirky object of speculation, but as a philosophical slap in the face. Because if this was truly a working battery, then it's not just about electricity. It's about expectations, about the arrogance of assuming we were the first to play with voltage. The first time we brought it up, we danced around possibilities: electroplating, religious rituals, medical experimentation, all fair guesses. But here, let's consider something even less comfortable: systematic knowledge. A single battery might be an accident, a one-off, but what if there were many? What if this wasn't a novelty, but part of a larger toolkit of missing infrastructure? You don't invent a battery just to store it on a shelf. You use it, which implies circuits, applications, perhaps even an understanding of chemical reactions that extends far beyond what dusty textbooks claim the Parthians or Sassanids were capable of. And maybe that's the real terror. Not that someone in ancient Mesopotamia made a battery, but that they forgot why. Because it begs the question: how many times has civilization booted itself up, learned a few tricks, and then hit delete? Also worth noting, the jar itself isn't decorated like a religious artifact. It doesn't scream symbolism. It screams utility. That alone breaks the pattern of what we expect from ancient items. Tools don't lie, but silence does, and we've been interpreting that silence as ignorance for centuries. So if the Baghdad Battery was part of a forgotten science, what else did they know? What else were they building? What else are we not digging up? Let's turn from electricity to etching, because the next mystery isn't powered by acid or current, but by symbols, deeply carved, inexplicably precise, and covering a rock slab the size of a small house. The Cochno Stone. Unearthed in 1887 near West Dunbartonshire, Scotland, and promptly reburied for its own protection in 1965, the Cochno Stone is a puzzle posing as a map pretending to be art. Measuring about 43 feet by 26 feet, it's etched with dozens, possibly hundreds soft spirals, circles, grooves, and symbols. The most intricate and extensive example of cup and ring marks in the British Isles, maybe in the world. When exposed, it looks like a cosmic circuit board, a relief sculpture designed not to be looked at, but to be decoded. And yet no one's cracked it, not even close. Cup and ring marks are found throughout Neolithic Europe, but the Cochno Stone is next level. It's not just decorative, it's obsessive, repetitive, intentional. The kind of thing that took time, planning, and most disturbingly a reason. Was it a map? A celestial chart? An agricultural calendar? A spiritual tool? All have been proposed, none have been proven. Some believe the spirals correspond to star paths. Others say the symbols mark burial sites, or ley lines those mythical energy corridors that New Age researchers adore and mainstream scholars ignore. There's even the theory that the stone is an ancient message board, a place to record significant events or teachings in a pre-literate symbolic language we've long since lost the key to. And still others suggest something more radical, that the entire slab was a kind of open-air interface, a teaching tool, a portal, a memory stone. Then came the 1960s, and the stone was buried. Not because it was cursed or radioactive, but because people kept vandalizing it. In a way, that says everything. Even when we find ancient knowledge carved into bedrock, we spray paint over it. That's progress. The Cochno Stone was re-excavated in the 2010s, briefly photographed, scanned, documented, but it was reburied again, still silent, still unread. Because the truth is, we don't know what it says, but it definitely says something. And that might be worse than saying nothing at all. And now we leap from etchings in stone to something even less traceable. People who appeared out of nowhere, civilized, literate, inventive, as if someone dropped them off with a starter pack and vanished. The origin of the Sumerians. They just show up. No slow buildup. No cave-dwelling prequel. The Sumerians emerge in southern Mesopotamia around 4000 BCE with agriculture, cities, metallurgy, complex legal codes, astronomy, write the world's first written language. They didn't evolve into civilization. They debuted it. This is not how history usually works. Cultures tend to emerge gradually, fragments becoming communities, communities becoming cities. But the Sumerians skipped the early drafts. They gave us cuneiform tablets, ziggurats, irrigation networks, lunar calendars, and government bureaucracy all at once. It's like someone hit fast forward while everyone else was still learning how to ferment barley. So, where did they come from? No one knows. Their language isn't Semitic. It's not Indo-European. It has no confirmed relatives. It's a linguistic orphan. And unlike the Akkadians or Babylonians, the Sumerians had myths that hinted at their own foreignness. Some texts even claim their knowledge came from beings known as the Anunnaki figures who descended from the sky to give order to the chaos. That's convenient, sure, but maybe not metaphorical. Their myths speak of advanced knowledge handed down, of instructions carved into tablets, of blueprints from the heavens. And unlike later mythologies, these stories feel strangely technical. Less fire and brimstone, more manual override. And then there's Eriduthe, first city, supposedly founded by the gods themselves. A place that, according to the Sumerians, wasn't just the start of their world, but the start of all civilization. Archaeologists remain baffled. There's no real cultural predecessor. No transitional Proto-Sumerian phase. They simply arrive, like an answer to a question no one thought to ask. Maybe they were survivors of an older civilization. Maybe they were seeded. Maybe they were just brilliant. But if they were the beginning, what came before them? And if they didn't invent their knowledge, or what did? Up next, we revisit a stone complex that could answer exactly that. A site so old, so out of place, it makes the Sumerians look like recent college grads. A place buried on purpose, and possibly built by no one we've ever heard of. The Gobekli Tepe. It's the site that broke archaeology. A hill in southeastern Turkey, ignored for decades as just another bump in a rugged landscape, until, in the 1990s, excavators started digging and unearthed a Neolithic structure so advanced, so out of place, that it might as well have come from a parallel timeline. Welcome to Gobekli Tepe. It's old, stupidly old. We're talking 11,000 years ago, thousands of years before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before writing, before agriculture, before humans were even supposed to be living in permanent settlements. Yet here stands a complex of massive stone pillars, some weighing more than 20 tons, arranged in intricate circular enclosures. Many are decorated with reliefs of animal scorpions, foxes, snake sand humanoid figures that seem neither decorative nor symbolic, but mythic. They almost remember something. So how did hunter-gatherers build this? According to conventional models of human development, they couldn't have. They didn't have the organization, or the time, or the tools. Civilization was supposed to come after farming. But Gobekli Tepe suggests the opposite, that perhaps it was religion, ceremony, or even trauma that came first. That belief and mystery were the roots of society, not the fruits. And then there's the kicker. It was buried. Intentionally. The entire site was backfilled with debris. Carefully. Deliberately. As if someone wanted to preserve it or erase it. Why? No one knows. Maybe they outgrew it. Maybe it was cursed. Or maybe they didn't want whatever it was built for to wake up. Gobekli Tepe doesn't just shift the timeline, it shatters it. It suggests that people had knowledge, coordination, and purpose long before they were civilized, and that perhaps we've mistaken primitive for post-cataclysmic. It also forces us to ask, how many other sites this old are still hidden beneath our feet because no one thought to look? And speaking of things we weren't supposed to find, the next entry is even more suspicious. It's a map faded, disputed, inconvenient. And if it's real, it suggests that someone mapped America before Columbus even had a boat. The puzzling map of Vinland. The Vinland map is one of those artifacts that academics wish had never been found. First made public in the 1960s, the map allegedly dates back to the 15th century. And yet, there it is. A clear depiction of part of the North American coast, specifically Vinland, the land described in Norse sagas. If it's authentic, it rewrites the history of exploration. It confirms that someone knew about America before Columbus discovered it in 1492. Not just the vague notion of Western lands, but their geography, coastal outlines, relative positions, labeled. Naturally, the scholarly community has gone to war over it. Some insist it's a modern forgery, maybe even a prank. Others point to chemical analysis of the ink, parchment dating, and linguistic clues that support its authenticity. The ink, for instance, contains anatacetitanium dioxide, which some say couldn't have been used before the 20th century. But others argue that the presence of anatase isn't conclusive proof of forgery. It could occur naturally or through contamination. And then there's the political angle. The map, if real, supports the Norse claim to having reached America centuries before Columbus. That's uncomfortable for the narrative of European superiority, the idea that history began with conquest. Because if the Vikings knew and documented it, then what else did they document? And what other maps are hidden, misplaced, or destroyed? The Vinland map also hints at something more insidious, the suppression of knowledge. It wasn't discovered in a grand museum, but surfaced through private collectors and obscure acquisitions. Some suspect the Vatican, secret archives, or imperial agendas had reasons to suppress or mislabel it, not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient. And maybe that's the real point. History isn't written by the victors, it's rewritten by those who inherit their libraries. If the Vinland map is a fake, it's a very clever one. But if it's real, then everything we think we know about the Age of Discovery starts to look like a cover story. Let's move from maps to shapes, from coastlines to columns, from ink on parchment to rock in the ground. Because up next is a geological wonder that's either a freak of nature or something far more calculated. The Giant's Causeway. On the northern coast of Ireland, nature decided to get suspiciously symmetrical. Thousands of interlocking basalt columns rise from the sea like the fingers of a buried machine, mostly hexagonal, some with as many as 8 sides, all tightly packed as if designed by a geologist with OCD. Welcome to the Giant's Causeway. According to science, it was formed 50 to 60 million years ago by volcanic activity. Lava cooled rapidly, cracked, and contracted, forming geometric columns, a rare but natural process. Textbook. Except, it doesn't feel natural. Stand on it, and it feels like you're walking through the ruins of something. Not a natural cliff, but a courtyard. Not a beach, but a blueprint. There's order here, repetition, pattern. And humans, being the pattern-obsessed creatures we are, have never trusted it. That's where the myths come in. Irish folklore tells us that the causeway was built by the giant Fionn mac Cumhaill as a bridge to Scotland, to fight his Scottish counterpart. He ripped it from the sea, stone by stone, and when he realized his enemy was even bigger, he ran back and tore it apart behind him. Childish? Maybe. But also poetic. Because if there's one thing this place evokes, it's scale. It feels used, somehow, as if it was walked on, built for something bigger than us. Whether by nature or by hands we've long forgotten. And it's not alone. Similar formations exist in other parts of the world, Staffa in Scotland, the Devil's Postpile in California, which raises a strange thought. What if these weren't isolated incidents? What if these were sites used, repurposed, ritualized by cultures that saw them not as accidents, but invitations? Today, the Giant's Causeway is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, surrounded by railings and tourism. But look closely, and you'll see something else. Precision, pretending to be coincidence. A question pretending to be an answer. And from that illusion of structure, we now move to another architectural mystery, this one deliberately man-made, and everywhere. A kind of prehistoric skyscraper built in the middle of the Mediterranean, by a people who left behind tower sand no blueprints, the Sardinian Nuraghe. Scattered across the rugged island of Sardinia are thousands of enigmatic stone towers called Nuraghe, over 7,000 of them. Massive conical dry stone structures, some standing over 60 feet tall. They dot the landscape like ancient watchtowers, keeping guard over a secret no one's ever told. Built between 1,900 and 730 BCE or so, we think they are the defining legacy of the Nuragic civilization, which is about as vague a name as archaeology can offer. We named the people after their buildings because we know almost nothing about who they were. No written language, no surviving texts. Just these looming, complex fortresses made from multi-ton stones stacked with no mortar, but with eerie stability. Some Nuraghe are solitary towers. Others are complexes, multi-towered fortresses with corbelled chambers, spiral staircases, and defensive walls. They were clearly more than shelters. Some align with solar events. Others stand on strategic points, as if guarding trade routes or territorial boundaries. But for what purpose? Defense? Ceremony? Storage? Observatory? No one agrees, and the Nuragic people aren't around to ask. More intriguing still, these towers were often added onto over centuries, expanded, modified, used. That suggests continuity. Generations of builders working with knowledge passed down, not improvised. And that knowledge wasn't basic. These towers used advanced construction techniques, inclined walls, false vaulting, and clever drainage. The stones are placed with a kind of intuitive geometry that rivals Incan masonry. They feel engineered, not just built. Theories abound that the Nuraghe were tribal fortresses, that they were astronomical observatories, that they were ritual spaces or seats of regional power. But the truth is simpler and more disturbing. We just don't know, which makes the scale of their construction all the more astonishing. Because a forgotten people built thousands of monumental towers across centuries with no known script, no unbroken cultural lineage, and no surviving narrative. If the stones could talk, they might say, we were not simple. But let's leave behind the Mediterranean hills and plunge deep into myth far deeper than sea level. Because the next city we explore doesn't exist, allegedly. But it's been haunting the edges of human memory for over 2,000 years. The lost city of Atlantis. Plato introduced it in Timaeus and Critias, a vast, advanced island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, more powerful than any contemporary state, brought low by its own hubris and swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. Atlantis. Since then, the name has been thrown around more than a political scandal. It's been found everywhere from the Caribbean to Antarctica, from the Azores to the Sahara. Everyone wants Atlantis. Everyone needs it to be real. Because if it is, then civilization didn't just rise one seat rose, fell, and left behind a ghost that refuses to shut up. What did Plato actually say? That Atlantis was technologically sophisticated, with canals, temples plated in orichalcum, massive military fleets, and kings descended from gods. That it existed 9,000 years before his time. That it waged war on Proto-Athens, and that the gods punished its arrogance with catastrophic destruction. Was he recording a memory? A parable? A coded historical account passed down through Egyptian priests? Or was it fiction designed to illustrate moral decay? Modern scholars lean toward the allegory theory. Plato wasn't a historian, they say. He was warning against imperial overreach, which would be neat and tidy if so many cultures didn't have their own flood myths, sunken lands, and tales of golden ages ending in deluge. The Hopi have it, the Sumerians have it, the Hindus have it, the Greeks obviously had it. How many cultures accidentally made up the same story? And then, there are the ruins. Underwater structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and Cuba. Submerged megaliths, road-like formations, and hints of forgotten architecture drowned beneath rising seas. Are they natural? Maybe. Are they Atlantis? Probably not. But are they proof that advanced societies once lived where the water now rules? That's harder to dismiss. Atlantis isn't just a myth. It's an anchor, a gravitational point around which our forbidden fantasies orbit. The idea that something great came before, and we are the flickering remnants. And that brings us, fittingly, to its long-lost sibling. Not a city, but a continent. Not Greek, but global. The name changes depending on which ocean you drown in. Lemuria. 2 continents. 1 mystery. Mu was dreamed up in the 19th century by Augustus Leplongeon, who believed he had translated ancient Mayan texts describing a lost land in the Pacific Mu, the motherland of all civilizations. A place that supposedly sank after a cataclysm, erasing the memory of humanity's true origin. Then came Lemuria, name born not from mythology but from zoology. Scientists in the 1800s needed to explain why lemurs appeared in both Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East. So they hypothesized a sunken landmass that once connected the regions. Lemuria became shorthand for a missing link geologically and mythically. But it didn't stay scientific for long. Esoteric thinkers like Helena Blavatsky adopted Lemuria into the canon of theosophy, transforming it into a spiritual Eden inhabited by psychic beings, hermaphroditic proto-humans, and ancient masters of unknown technologies. Mu, meanwhile, was popularized by James Churchward as a land of temples, lasers, and wisdom beyond our comprehension. You know the usual. These weren't just islands. They were primordial civilizations, cradles of humanity, destroyed by hubris, misalignment with cosmic laws, or plain old tectonic revenge. Mainstream science says, nonsense. Plate tectonics don't work like that. Continents don't just vanish without leaving a trace. The evidence for Mu and Lemuria is anecdotal, imaginative, and often overtly racist, implying non-European knowledge had to come from somewhere other than the people themselves. But despite this, the myths persist. Because lost continents offer something we can't get from history books: context. A way to explain the unexplained. A reason why ancient civilizations across the globe all built pyramids, worshipped sky beings, and tracked the stars with obsessive precision. Maybe Mu and Lemuria never physically existed. Maybe they're allegories for something older than land-like cultural memory. A story we tell ourselves about how far we've fallen. And if these continents were real enough, then the technologies they allegedly possessed were not fantasy. Let's prove it. Because in the next story, we fly on machines described in ancient Indian texts. Machines that make the Wright brothers look like toddlers with kites. The Vimanas of ancient India. They're described in ancient Sanskrit texts like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Vaimanika Shastra flying machines known as Vimanas. They came in various shapes and sizes, some disc-shaped, some pyramid-like, some more like chariots, but without horses and with vertical takeoff capability, powered by mysterious fuels, moving in ways that defy gravity, logic, and modern aeronautics. They weren't just poetic metaphors. The descriptions are technical. They mention propulsion systems, mercury-based engines, solar energy, multi-level interiors, aerial dogfights, even stealth mechanisms. This isn't the language of mythology. It reads more like a user manual dictated by someone who wasn't allowed to include schematics. And the texts that describe them aren't marginal. They're central pillars of Indian epics. Revered scriptures. Sacred, yes, but also disturbingly detailed. Too detailed. Mainstream scholars write off Vimanas as mythic constructs vehicles for gods, symbolic of divine authority and cosmic battle. That's safe, that's academic, but not everyone agrees. Some believe the ancient authors were describing real technology, real craft, and the gods? Maybe just pilots. The Vaimanika Shastra, discovered in the early 20th century but allegedly based on much older texts, attempts to explain how Vimanas worked complete with propulsion methods, materials, flight paths, and anti-gravity principles. Its authenticity is hotly debated. But even if it's not ancient, the question remains: why would someone invent such specific and advanced descriptions in an era when planes were still made of canvas and wood? If these machines existed, where are the remnants? That's the catch. The Indian subcontinent is notorious for monsoons, erosion, and centuries of repurposing old materials. But maybe we're not supposed to find the remains. Maybe these were made from materials we wouldn't recognize. Or maybe, like every good piece of forgotten tech, they self-destructed when the user got careless. In the end, we're left with a riddle. Either ancient India imagined advanced aerial technology with suspicious accuracy, or they saw it, used it, or inherited it. From the sky to the earth, let's pivot to something solid, something tall, something made of iron that refuses to rust, a monument to both metallurgy and mystery. The Iron Pillar of Delhi. It stands quietly in the Qutb complex in Delhi, India. 7-meter-high iron column, over 1,600 years old, weighing more than 6 tons. By all conventional logic, it should be a crumbling, orange-rusted relic. Instead, the Iron Pillar of Delhi still stands strong, smooth, untarnished, rust-resistant to a degree that makes modern engineers blink and mutter. Erected during the Gupta Empire, it was likely meant to honor a Hindu deity, or perhaps a great king. But the real miracle isn't who put it up, it's how it was made. Because the pillar is composed of 98% wrought iron, forged with such purity and in such massive quantity that even today, replicating its corrosion resistance is no small feat. India's climate is not kind to metal. Monsoons, humidity, urban smog, plenty of reasons for iron to decay. And yet this pillar has survived over a millennium with barely a blemish. So how? Theories vary. Some point to the high phosphorus content in the iron. Others credit ancient forging techniques that created a passive layer of Misawaitia, complex crystalline iron hydrogen phosphate in the surface. Translation: magic rust armor. But no other ancient iron structure seems to benefit from the same trick. What if it wasn't a trick? What if it was a recipe? There's a suggestion, whispered more than written, that the pillar is a relic of lost metallurgy, that the builders knew things we've forgotten, not just techniques but intent. Maybe the goal wasn't just durability, it was resonance. Some researchers note the pillar's magnetic qualities. Its sonic resonance when struck, as if it's not just a monument, but a tuning fork. To what? We don't know. But doesn't that feel familiar? Every culture has a relic it shouldn't be able to make. A structure that lasts too long, works too well, or refuses to explain itself. This pillar doesn't shout, it doesn't glow, it just stands calm, ancient, untouched by time. But now, let's leave the land of metallurgical marvels and plunge into something far stranger. Something round, small, and etched with symbols no one can read, claimed by some to be an alien user manual, disguised as a stone disk. The Dropa stones. In the remote Baigong mountains of China, in a region where the air thins and myths grow fat, there's a tale that sounds too cinematic to be true. In the 1930s, a team of archaeologists allegedly discovered dozens, some say hundreds, soft stone discs buried in caves. Each was roughly a foot in diameter, with a perfectly round hole in the center. And etched into their surfaces? Tiny spiraling grooves, like grooves on a vinyl record. Except these weren't music, they were said to be inscriptions. Microscopic writing, unknown language. These are the Dropa stones, or at least they're supposed to be. The story goes that Chinese researcher Dr. Tsum Nui, a name now shrouded in controversy, deciphered the inscriptions and published his translation. The stones, he claimed, told of a spacecraft crash landing in the mountains 12,000 years ago. The beings aboard, small, fragile, with large heads and weak limbs, were the Dropa. They couldn't leave. They were stranded. Eventually, they intermarried with local tribes and died. The stones were their history left behind, not to warn, but to be remembered. Mainstream historians call it a hoax, a fabrication. Dr. Tsum's name doesn't appear in formal academic records. The original stones have mysteriously disappeared. The whole thing reeks of Cold War-era pseudoscience, conveniently unverifiable, probably imaginary. But if it's fake, it's a clever one. Too clever. Some alleged photos of the stones exist. One, in particular, shows a disc with a central hole and faint spiral markings. It's been dismissed as a misidentified grinding stone. But that's the thing about ancient anomalies. They always look like tools until someone reads them. No one has proven the inscriptions exist. No one has found the stones in a curated museum. No one has replicated the supposed writing. But the legend persists. Because even if the stones are false, the story feels true. It mirrors too many other things. Crashed visitors, cave-dwelling ancestors, hidden histories carved in stone. The Dropa stones may be missing, but the idea behind them, the transmission of cosmic knowledge to early humans, isn't. And the next artifact picks up that same signal. This time not with grooves in stone, but with wings carved from wood. An ancient object that looks just aerodynamic enough to make you squint and just absurd enough to make you wonder if someone actually tried to fly it. The Saqqara bird. In a glass case in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo rests a small wooden object, roughly 2,200 years old. It's carved from sycamore, wings outstretched, tail angled, light enough to glide, abstract enough to confuse, and aerodynamic enough to start fights among experts. It's known as the Saqqara bird, and it looks, whether it should or not, like a model airplane. Officially, it's labeled as a ceremonial object, possibly a toy, maybe a weather vane, a representation of a bird-shaped deity, some suggest. But All of those explanations feel like cover stories when you actually examine it. The Saqqara bird has no feet. Its tail is vertical, like a modern airplane's rudder, not horizontal like a bird's. And its wings, thick, tapering, and perfectly symmetrical, resemble the wings of any known bird species. In fact, some engineers have noted that the design contains elements of a modern glider, which opens up the real question: were the ancient Egyptians experimenting with flight? Some researchers, mostly outside the mainstream, have gone further. They've built scale models of the Saqqara bird, with slight modifications, a stabilizing tailplane, for example, and demonstrated that it can glide short distances. Was this little carving a prototype? A toy based on a larger, forgotten machine? Or simply the lingering memory of something that once soared? Of course, none of this proves the Egyptians had planes, but it doesn't disprove that someone, at some point, might have had the idea of flight. And in a culture so obsessed with the heavens, with the soul taking wing, with gods in the sky, it's not hard to imagine them trying to replicate what they saw in their dreams, or in the sky. So we're left with a choice. A stylized wooden bird that accidentally mimics modern aerodynamics, or a symbolic echo of a forgotten attempt to challenge gravity. And from air to mystery, we now shift to objects so oddly shaped, so out of place, that even after centuries of study, we still don't know whether to hold them, worship them, or roll them across a table. 12 sides, no known purpose, and absolutely no patience for easy answers. The Roman dodecahedra. Dozens of them have been found across Europesmal, hollow, bronze, or stone artifacts with 12 flat faces, each a pentagon, at the center of each face, a hole, not all the same size. Some are larger, some smaller, and each corner of the dodecahedron is capped with a small knob. No writing, no instructions, no standard size. They date to the 2nd or 3rd century CE. Roman era, sure. But no Roman texno-historian, no inventory, no dusty scroll mentions them, not even in passing. They simply exist, in fields and tombs, in treasure hoards and random dirt, found from England to Hungary, and not a single person knows what they were for. Theories, of course, abound. Candle holders, dice, weapon attachments, gauge tools for measuring projectile size, astronomical instruments. Knitting aids, even yes, some insist they were used to create uniform gloves, because when the Romans weren't conquering continents, they were definitely focused on winter fashion. None of these theories quite satisfy, because the craftsmanship is too consistent to be random and too diverse to be standardized. Some have different sized holes on opposing sides perhaps to measure or view something, but then why the knobs? Why the lack of wear marks? And most damningly, why are they found nowhere near major urban centers or workshops? Always in the quiet margins, as if discarded, or left as markers for something else entirely. Then there's the more esoteric view, that they were ritual objects, tied to mystery religions or divination, devices used to predict planting seasons, tools to calculate celestial alignments. Not scientific in the modern sense, but functional, spiritual tech. In other words, they weren't designed to do something, they were designed to mean something. We don't know, and that's the point. They're symbols without a legend, the kind of object you could hold in your hand for years and still not unlock. So we place them on shelves, behind glass, and move on hoping no one notices that the world's most organized empire left behind a riddle made of bronze. Now, from indecipherable shapes to entire books, we can't read. Let's enter the thick, illustrated madness of a codex that no one, not even AI, can crack. A manuscript filled with plants that don't exist, language that defies classification, and logic that whispers like a fever dream. The Voynich manuscript. It's 240 pages of what the hell. Discovered, or rather, surfaced in 912, when rare book dealer Wilfrid Voynich purchased a collection of manuscripts from an Italian monastery. The Voynich manuscript has become the Mona Lisa of undeciphered texts. Bound in vellum and written in an unknown script, it contains looping, flowing characters that resemble writing but match no known alphabet, ancient or modern. It's not just the language that confounds, it's the content. Page after page is filled with bizarre botanical drawings of non-existent plants, strange star charts, naked women bathing in interconnected tubs, possibly representing wombs or alchemical processes, or a really confusing plumbing diagram. Some pages include what look like recipes. Others resemble medical or astrological diagrams made by someone who had no regard for reality or anatomy. Cryptographers have been obsessed with the manuscript for over a century. The NSA took a swing at it. So did Alan Turing's successors. So have countless amateur codebreakers. No one has cracked it. Some say it's a hoax, a prank by a medieval scribe to dupe a wealthy patron. But that theory falls apart when you realize how consistent the writing is. Hundreds of pages, flawlessly maintained. Not gibberish, just unreadable. Others think it's a Cypher language disguised to protect secrets. But if so, the cipher is unlike any ever encountered. And it appears to follow linguistic rules. Word patterns, character distributions, grammatical structures. It acts like a real language. It just isn't one we recognize. And then there are those who say it's the product of a lost civilization, or even non-human origin, a memory artifact, a dream transmitted, a manual for a world we don't remember living in. Regardless, it holds its silence, and we hold our breath, flipping through illustrations of impossible herbs and unreadable medicine, wondering, is this a message we're too late to understand? Or too early? The Voynich manuscript doesn't tell us what it is, it makes us ask what we are missing. And from pages to pyramids, from code to concrete, our next mystery points to a global pattern, because while Egypt may have the most famous pyramids, it certainly doesn't have the only ones. The purpose of the pyramids worldwide. Pyramids are not an Egyptian thing, they're a planetary phenomenon. Found on every inhabited continent, built by civilizations that had no known contact with each other, and yet somehow landed on the same architectural obsession: broad base, narrowing apex, celestial alignment. Pyramids in Egypt, in Sudan, in Mesoamerica, in Indonesia, in China, in Peru, even on islands, even underwater, allegedly. Coincidence or conspiracy of geometry? The conventional explanation is that pyramids are a naturally stable structure. Stack stones too high, and physics will eventually tell you to widen your base. Fair enough. But that doesn't explain why these structures aren't just architectural. They're ritualistic, symbolic, cosmological. Most are aligned to celestial bodies, solstices, star systems. Many are covered in carvings linking them to gods, the afterlife, and cosmic balance, and more than a few are buried in legends about knowledge from the sky. But here's the real problem. Nobody agrees on what they were for. Tombs? That's the go-to. Yet many pyramids, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, contain no confirmed burial, no mummy, no funerary inscriptions. Others were clearly ceremonial, but their purpose has been lost to time. Were they calendars, stargates, power plants? Were they broadcasting something, receiving? In Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Sun is aligned with the setting sun on specific dates, and sits over strange underground chambers lined with mica heat-resistant mineral. In Cambodia, the Baigong Temple is a stepped pyramid with almost identical layout to those in Central America. And in China, entire pyramid fields lie hidden under forested hills, their entrances sealed, their contents officially unexplored. The similarities don't stop at shape, they extend to orientation, layering, and in some cases, internal chambers. which is troubling, because it suggests not just a shared idea but a shared blueprint. Could there have been a pre-flood civilization whose architectural knowledge was spread before a global catastrophe? Or did ancient builders all tune into the same mathematical harmony, the same celestial language, arriving at the pyramid as a kind of sacred inevitability? Either way, the structures remain vast, venerable, and still refusing to confess. Let's follow one to its ceiling, one carved not from stone, but from stars, a zodiac that challenges our entire sense of time. The age of the zodiac of Dendera. It's carved into the ceiling of a chapel in the Hathor temple at Dendera, Egypt, a circular zodiac, crowded with constellations, star deities, and planetary markers, lions, scorpions, crabs, bulls, all mapped in stone above a place where sky worship met sacred geometry. This is the zodiac of Dendera, and it is inconvenient. Mainstream Egyptology dates the carving to around 50 BCE, during the Ptolemaic era, long after Alexander's conquest. And yet the zodiac shows planetary alignments and precessional data that, if taken literally, point to a sky arrangement from as early as 10,000 BCE. That's not a small discrepancy. That's the difference between a late temple decoration and a star map of the Ice Age. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over a 26,000-year cycle, was supposedly discovered by Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE. But the Dendera Zodiac suggests someone understood it long before him. Someone who didn't just gaze at the stars, but tracked their motion through millennia. Not just astronomy but cosmology, calendar systems based on celestial mechanics. Some researchers argue the zodiac isn't literal, it's symbolic, mythological. That's safe. But symbols are never just symbols in Egypt. They are layered, encoded. They say 5 things at once. And at least one of them might be a date. If this ceiling was copied from older, now lost records, as many temples in Egypt wear it, means the Egyptians inherited astronomical knowledge they didn't originate. Which leads back to the same whisper we keep hearing, that someone older, someone forgotten, once charted the heavens and passed down the data before being erased. So is the zodiac a pretty ceiling? Or is it a fossil of precision too old to be remembered? And speaking of forgotten revolutions, what if we zoom all the way back down to Earth and examine the moment we stopped hunting and gathering and started farming? Because the beginning of agriculture looks a little too efficient. The origin of agriculture. Farming didn't slowly evolve, it exploded. Around 10,000 years ago, scattered human groups across the globe all decided, apparently at the same time, to stop being nomads and start planting seeds. In the Fertile Crescent, they grew wheat and barley. In China, millet and rice. In the Americas, maize, beans, squash. In Africa, sorghum. In Papua New Guinea, taro. Entirely different crops, entirely different cultures, same pivot. Agriculture appeared simultaneously, in disconnected regions, with little to no transitional phase, like an idea that just arrived, and humans adapted overnight. Why? According to traditional anthropology, it was environmental pressure. Climate stabilized, megafauna vanished, humans needed food security, so they started planting. But that logic falters when you realize that farming is harder than foraging. It's more labor, less dietary diversity, higher disease rates, and it requires planning, calendars, infrastructure, social hierarchy. Yet somehow, within just a few centuries, humans who had never domesticated anything were cultivating, irrigating, storing, and crossbreeding. How? Was it independently discovered multiple times through necessity? Or was it taught? There's a fringe idea, ridiculed but persistent, that agriculture was seeded by a forgotten civilization, that survivors of a lost advanced culture shared this knowledge with scattered tribes in the aftermath of a global catastrophe. Or, perhaps even more radically, that non-human intelligence introduced the idea of domestication, like terraforming consultants dropping by with starter kits. Too far? Maybe. But the fact remains, agriculture didn't stumble into existence. It arrived like a revelation. And with it came writing. Cities, time, property, war, bureaucracy, religion. Everything that defines civilization begins with planting a seed. Which makes you wonder, whose seed was it really? And speaking of origins, our next mystery asks how humanity itself narrowed from many into one. Because at the root of our family tree lies a strange coincidence, and two names that sound more biblical than biological. The genetic Adam and Eve. They weren't a couple. They didn't live in a garden. And they definitely didn't share a rib. But according to genetic science, every human alive today can trace their ancestry back to a single man and a single woman, not romantically linked but biologically definitive. These two figures are known as mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam, and they are the unintentional punchline to the oldest story ever told. Let's be clear, they didn't live at the same time. Genetic Eve is estimated to have lived around 150,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. Adam, meanwhile, clocks in at around 120,000 to 180,000 years ago, give or take, a few millennia. They didn't meet. They didn't date. They were just the two people whose mitochondrial DNA and Y-chromosome DNA, respectively, survived the relentless roulette of time. But the weird part isn't their existence, it's what their story implies. Because for this to happen, vast numbers of other humans' entire lineages, tribes, possibly civilizations had to die out, completely. Their genetic legacy wiped clean. Repeated bottlenecks, catastrophic events, or perhaps something else entirely left just these lineages intact. A single woman whose mitochondrial DNA was passed down unbroken through the mothers of mothers of mothers. A single man whose Y chromosome beat all the others. Why just them? Why then? Some scientists believe a major extinction or population collapse occurred, reducing humanity to a small breeding group. A volcanic eruption, an ice age, a pandemic, take your apocalyptic pick. Others suggest that the genetic bottleneck might be an illusion created by the way we interpret DNA data. But even the most conservative estimates admit something deeply unsettling. Our diversity is an illusion of geography. Genetically, we're all cousins, inbred cousins, at that. And still others whisper darker theories. That human evolution wasn't entirely natural. That we were pruned, selectively, consciously, or maybe seeded, restarted, rebooted by forces unknown. Whether alien, divine, or forgotten, something wiped the slate almost twice. So here we are, descendants of two ghosts whose names aren't really Eve or Adam, but whose existence still echoes like a divine joke. And speaking of misplaced objects that shouldn't exist but somehow do. Next mystery is a whole genre of them. Things that don't belong. Things that screw up the timeline. Things that quietly demand we burn the history books and start over. The out-of-place artifacts, OOP art, phenomenon. They're the party crashers of archaeology, the uninvited guests who ruin the narrative. OOP art's out-of-place artifacts are objects found in strata, contexts, or regions where they absolutely, positively, by every known measure of academic certainty, should not be. You've heard of some, the London Hammer, the Coso artifact, but those are just the tip of the temporal iceberg. There are reports of carved stone tools found in coal seams dating to hundreds of millions of years ago, inscriptions in caves said to predate writing by tens of thousands of years, mechanical objects embedded in geodes, ancient maps with modern accuracy, sculptures of modern animals or extinct creatures, and metallic spheres with precise grooves, allegedly pulled from Precambrian rock formations. Are all of them real? Absolutely not. Some are hoaxes, some are misinterpretations, some are the result of wishful thinking meeting poor stratigraphy, but some remain unexplained. And that's where the chill sets in. Because even a single real OOP art destroys the timeline. If one spark plug, one figurine, one screw-shaped anomaly is genuinely ancient, then everything we think we know about technological development becomes suspect. Human history stops being a straight line and becomes a tangle of false starts, forgotten epics, and rogue civilizations swallowed by time. Mainstream academia tends to handle OOP arts with silent indifference. Not because they aren't interesting, but because acknowledging them means entertaining a host of uncomfortable alternatives, that we aren't the first advanced society, that evolution doesn't proceed in one direction. That knowledge can be gained and lost, or stolen. Or worse, that we're living in the ruins of a world we never knew existed. OOP arts aren't just objects, they're artifacts of memory failure. They represent the things we weren't meant to find or the things we found, then buried again because they didn't fit. And now, we descend from accidental anomalies to a stone so intricate, so bizarre, it might be a piece of prehistoric tech or a monument to something far more complicated than decoration. Let's head to Ecuador, where a massive engraved megalith might be the most cryptic instruction manual you've never read. The Cochno Stone. It lies in silence, tucked away from the public eye, often ignored, sometimes suppressed, always inconvenient. Known as the Cochno Stone, or sometimes simply the carved rock of Ecuador, this enormous slab is covered in an impossibly intricate relief maps, lines, grids, and what some claim to be an aerial view of a pre-flood world. To skeptics, it's a weird rock. To others, it's a fossilized data drive. The stone depicts something, that much is clear. But what? Some say it's a topographical map. Rivers, mountains, possibly entire cities. Others see geometric symbols, mathematical engravings, maybe even circuit-like patterns. It looks, to the imaginative, like blueprints, not of buildings, but of systems, energy, movement, intelligence. The Cochno Stone defies classification because it doesn't belong to any known indigenous style. It's not Incan, it's not Olmec, it's not Aztec, it's something other. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because if it's not part of any known lineage, it might be from a forgotten one, a missing link in the story of civilization. Some researchers claim that parts of the stone resemble ancient star maps. Others insist it contains numerical codes, mathematical constants embedded in the shapes. There's even the theory that it documents the Earth before a major catastrophe, that it's a literal map of Atlantis, or Mu, or something else entirely that no longer exists. The problem is, it's hard to prove anything when half the archaeological community refuses to engage with it. The stone remains hidden, partly due to politics, partly due to logistical access, and partly because its implications are radioactive. Because if the Cochno Stone is what some claim, then we are looking at a technological or cartographical relic from a civilization that predates everything we call history, something not primitive, but precise. Something with intent. And that's the haunting possibility, that someone once charted the world with a precision we can barely match and left us a single slab to remember them by. From a stone that may map a vanished world, we now pivot to the world that did vanish. A flourishing island civilization whose end wasn't gradual, but sudden, like a switch flipped, or a curse fulfilled. The disappearance of the Minoan civilization. At their peak, the Minoans were the architects of a maritime empire, so sophisticated it barely feels ancient. Based on the island of Crete, they built sprawling palaces with indoor plumbing, complex drainage systems, and vibrant murals that feel closer to Mediterranean Art Nouveau than Bronze Age iconography. They had writing systems Linear A and later Linear B. They worshipped a pantheon unlike their neighbors, with goddesses, bulls, and snake-wielding priestesses dancing through their mythology. And then they vanished. No slow fade, no steady decline. The Minoan civilization collapsed in what feels like an instant. Cities abandoned, scripts unread, power dissolved. Theories abound, the most prominent, a catastrophic natural disaster. The eruption of Thera on the nearby island of Santorini is believed to have been one of the most powerful volcanic events in recorded history. It could have triggered tsunamis, ash fallout, climate shifts, any one of which might be civilization ending, combined, apocalyptic. But here's where it gets murky. The timing doesn't quite line up. Some data suggests the eruption occurred decades, maybe even centuries before the full collapse of Minoan power. So, was the disaster just the first domino? Or are we misreading the sequence? Others argue that the Mycenaeans, their mainland rivals, took advantage of the Minoans' weakened state and invaded. Still, others point to trade disruption, social unrest, or divine retribution. Pick your poison. What's most haunting isn't the fall, it's the silence afterward. A people so artistic, so organized, so visionary, swallowed by time with barely a whisper. Their palatial complexes like Nazca swear buried, misattributed, and nearly forgotten until modern excavations resurrected their memory. But Linear A, still undeciphered. Their music, gone. Their stories, lost. We only know them by their ruins and their absence, and perhaps by what came next. Because the fall of the Minoans may have been the spark that ignited the next legend, the one that still haunts maps and movies alike. The Thera eruption. If Mount Vesuvius was a firecracker, Thera was a bomb. Around 1600 BCE, though dates vary, an island in the Aegean Sea exploded. Not metaphorically, literally. The island we now call Santorini was once a circular landmass with a volcano at its heart. When it blew, it triggered one of the most devastating natural events in human history. The caldera collapsed. Ash covered much of the eastern Mediterranean. Tsunamis ravaged the coastlines of Crete, Cyprus, and beyond. It was a Bronze Age extinction-level event for coastal cities and, possibly, for the Minoans. Ash layers found in Greenland, ice cores, and sediment across the region matched the eruption. Entire towns were buried in pumice. Earthquakes likely shattered infrastructure. Climate anomalies may have followed. Crops failed. Trade died. Social cohesion splintered. Some believe this was the event that inspired the Atlantis myth. Plato wrote of a powerful island nation that fell due to pride and divine punishment, sunk in a single night of catastrophe. Sound familiar? But the eruption alone doesn't explain everything. Minoan culture survived briefly after Thera. So did other civilizations. So why the near-total erasure? Maybe the eruption was just the start. A cosmic 1-2 punch. First came the fire, then the wave, then the famine, then the war. Maybe Thera didn't destroy the Minoans but left them weakened, vulnerable, and someone else took their place. Or maybe the eruption was symbolic as much as it was physical, the start of a long unraveling, a reminder that no matter how sophisticated your plumbing, the earth can still flush you away. Today, Santorini's crescent cliffs tell the story in negative space, the missing center of the island, a hollowed-out echo of its explosive past. And if one volcanic boom could end a civilization, what about a land covered in glyphs, raised fields, and canals so vast they can only be seen from the sky? Let's head to Bolivia, where the ground itself appears carved with purpose. The geoglyphs of Bolivia. High in the Bolivian Amazon, where the jungle swallows time and modernity alike, lies a landscape etched by human hands, not recently, and not for show. These are the geoglyphs of Bolivia, vast earthworks that stretch across hundreds of square miles, invisible from ground level, yet unmistakably intentional from above. We're talking canals, raised fields, causeways, and even symbolic shapesbirds, serpents, geometrical patterns, each one carved into the land with the kind of effort usually reserved for empires. But here's the twist. No empire officially claimed them. No texts describe them. No tombs or monuments explain them. They predate the Inca. They predate written history in the region. And they're so sprawling that modern researchers only began understanding their scope with the help of satellite imaging and aerial photography. Which begs the question, what kind of culture was capable of shaping the earth this way? At first glance, these formations seem agricultural. The raised fields and irrigation systems point to large-scale, highly adaptive farming. In a region prone to flooding and drought, these earthworks managed water like an ancient terraforming project. It wasn't just functional, it was ecological genius. But then come the glyphs, spirals, animal forms, patterns that don't irrigate or feed but symbolize. Were these ceremonial landscapes, sky signs, territorial claims to gods watching from above? There's no record of who made them, no preserved tools, no city centers, just the carvings and the quiet. Some date them to 500 BCE, others argue they're older, maybe much older. Some of the most complex layouts rival Nazca in their precision and scale. They raise uncomfortable possibilities that civilizations in the Amazon were not isolated bands of foragers, but engineers, that they built not with stone, but with land, and that they shaped the jungle not the other way around. And if that's true, then what else lies buried under centuries of vines and silence? Next, we head deeper into the Andes, beneath the shimmering surface of a sacred Lakido, search for the sunken remains of an ancient world, one that may have held the key to all the others. The underwater stone structures of Lake Titicaca, high in the Andes, straddling the border between Peru and Bolivia, Lake Titicaca rests like a mirror between worlds, between countries, between sky and water, between myth and memory. The highest navigable lake in the world, sacred to the Inca, older than the Incas, revered by cultures who had no word for ancient because their ancestors were already buried beneath its waves. And then came the discovery, stone structures beneath the surface. Divers exploring the lake in the early 2000s found what appeared to be a submerged temple complex, more than 1,000 feet long, massive stones, platforms, steps, paths. The kind of architecture we associate with ceremonial centers, not flukes of geology. Some researchers claimed it dated back over 1,500 years. Others speculated it was much older, possibly a relic of the Tiwanaku culture, or even a precursor civilization whose name has long since drowned. The site lies near the island of the sun Isla del Sol, where Incan myth says the first humans were created. Not found, not evolved, created, by the sun god himself. This isn't coincidental. The lake was considered the origin point of humanity. And what do you build at the cradle of your species? Temples, portals, anchors. But the water hides more than stones. It conceals a history that may stretch back to the last ice age, when lake levels were different, and people may have walked where fish now swim. What happened? A flood? An earthquake? A collapse? Or perhaps a slow drowning so gradual it became legend? Modern archaeologists tread carefully here. The lake is remote, the visibility poor, the politics complex. But that doesn't stop the questions. If a sacred temple lies beneath the water, what lies deeper? Was there a city? A shoreline culture lost to time? And how many other high-altitude lakes conceal the same secret? From one sunken mystery to another, but this time, above ground, and older than it should be. A desert complex in Peru that looks like the prototype for civilization itself. No pyramids, no wars. Just planning, symmetry, and an architecture of peace. The Caral-Supe civilization, tucked away in the Supe Valley of coastal Peru, Caral looks deceptively unimpressive at first glance: stone mounds, sun-baked plazas, and remnants of circular structures. No golden artifacts. No dramatic murals. No war imagery. But here's the catch. It's over 5,000 years old. That makes the Caral-Supe civilization one of the oldest known in the Americas and possibly the entire world. Contemporary with ancient Egypt and Sumer, but built without the wheel, without metallurgy, and without writing. Yet somehow, with urban planning that would put modern suburbs to shame. Caral includes pyramids, not towering ones, but broad-tiered platforms that suggest ceremonial or civic function. There are sunken circular plaza spaces for communal gathering or ritual performance. Irrigation canals run with maddening precision. Evidence suggests an economy based on fishing and agriculture. They cultivated cotton not for food, but for fishing nets and textiles. An early symbiosis of land and sea. And here's the most curious part. No signs of warfare. No fortifications. No weapons. No mass graves. For a culture this old, that's anomalous. Most early societies carry the scars of conquest, sacrifice, or collapse. But Caral? It radiates cooperation, order, intent. What kind of people built a civilization this complex, without fighting over it? Some scholars suggest Caral was a kind of socio-cultural experiment, a ceremonial hub, attracting scattered communities to share knowledge, trade goods, and engage in spiritual rituals. It was a society driven by ideas, not domination. That makes it even more mysterious. Because how did such a peaceful, complex civilization vanish so completely? There are theories. Environmental degradation, trade collapse, a simple decline. But none of them explain the clean disappearance. No invading culture left its stamp. No burning layers. Just wind. Time, and a site that was too old to be remembered when the Inca were still learning to stack stones. Caral is the ghost of a civilization that succeeded without conquest, and maybe that's why we forgot it. From desert planning to legends of giant sour, Next Mystery leaves behind ruins and looks at the people themselves. Or at least, the stories about people too tall to fit through our version of history. Because when bones grow beyond the standard model, so do the lies trying to bury them. The giants of ancient lore. They show up everywhere across continents, cultures, and centuries. Giants, not metaphorical ones. Literal beings, described in myths, scriptures, and even some baffling archaeological claims as standing 8, 10, even 12 feet tall, sometimes more. The Bible has them, the Nephilim, offspring of the sons of God and daughters of men. Native American tribes speak of red-haired giants, fierce and cannibalistic. Norse mythology, frost giants. Hindu texts, Rakshasas. Ancient Greece, titans. Everywhere, people have told stories of enormous beings who ruled, fell, or were cast down. And that's just the mythology. Then come the whispers from the dig sites. Reports of oversized human bones unearthed in remote caves, fields, and burial mounds. Femurs too long, skulls too big. Teeth that don't belong. Photos circulate tegrany, often doctored but persistent. Claims surface about the Smithsonian allegedly acquiring giant skeletons and then losing them. Suppression or sloppiness. Hard to tell, but the pattern is the same. A discovery, a press buzz, and then nothing. Mainstream science says these stories are fabrications, exaggerations, misidentified remains, or in some cases, victims of gigantisma, rare but natural condition, which is fair. Skepticism is healthy. But when so many cultures share the same archetype giants born of gods or fallen from heaven, you start to wonder, what are we remembering? Could there have been a race of abnormally large humans? Survivors of an earlier epoch, altered by environment or genetics or something else entirely? Were they a different species, or hybrids? If so, What happened to them? Did they die off? Interbreed? Get wiped out in a flood? Maybe the stories were never literal. Maybe giants were symbolic stand-ins for fallen empires or forgotten ancestors. Or maybe they were real. And the fact that we keep trying to forget them is the most telling clue of all. Because history is written by the survivors. But legends? Legends are written by the haunted. Next, we follow the myth even further north to a frozen land of eternal light, perfect harmony, and radiant beings. A place so idyllic it was declared unreachable and possibly never real. But some say it was real. And it was ours, before we lost it. The Hyperborea myth. In the farthest reaches of the ancient world, beyond the north wind, beyond the ice and snow and comprehension, lies the whispered land of Hyperborea. A place so perfect that death was optional. A paradise untouched by time, weather, or war. Ancient Greek writers described it as a realm of eternal spring, where the sun never set, and the inhabitants lived in harmony with nature and, possibly, the gods themselves. Hyperborea was not just another utopia, it was north. Not symbolically, geographically. Herodotus placed it beyond the lands of the Celts. Pindar called it, neither by ship nor on foot could one reach the Hyperboreans. Others mentioned a sacred connection to Apollo, who supposedly spent his winters there before returning to Delphi. If Olympus was the mountaintop of the gods, Hyperborea was the gods' vacation home. The inhabitants were described as tall, radiant, almost divine. They lived for 1,000 years, sang songs, played lyres, and spent their time in joy not, the cultish, forced kind of joy, but the kind civilizations dream of before they burn themselves down. There were no temples in Hyperborea. The land was the temple, which sounds suspiciously familiar. A golden age, a perfect civilization lost to time, another Atlantis, another Lemuria, but Hyperborea wasn't submerged, it was hidden, beyond reach. Locked behind ice and myth. Some fringe theorists have taken the story literally, suggesting Hyperborea once existed in the Arctic at the North Pole itself. That before the Earth shifted, or the axis wobbled, or the cataclysms came, this polar paradise thrived in a temperate climate, and when the world changed, it froze, sealed beneath miles of glacial indifference. Others link Hyperborea to ancient Antarctica, or to supposed lost continents under the ice. Still, others tie it to the Aryan myths, in dangerous, revisionist ways best left in the dustbin of ideology. But the deeper idea persists, that there was a land, once, where people lived without fear, a blueprint, a cosmic memory. And perhaps the ache we feel when we hear these myths isn't about the land we've lost, but about the kind of people we stopped being. Now, let's take a long descent from ice to Earth's inner fire, because the next mystery doesn't just look for a forgotten world, it looks for one inside this one. The Agartha Hollow Earth Theory. Beneath your feet, beneath the crust and magma and pressure we pretend to understand, lies another world. At least according to the enduring myth of Agartha, hidden civilization existing within the hollow shell of the earth. It's not a modern idea. Ancient Buddhists spoke of Shambhala, a sacred inner city of enlightenment. Hindu texts refer to Patala, an underground realm of serpents and gods. Even Christian Apocrypha whispers of realms below the earth, not just as hell, but as domains of forgotten tribes. But it wasn't until the 17th century that the idea of a hollow earth started to take form as pseudo-scientific speculation. Later, in the 19th and 20th centuries, it got an upgrade complete with alleged maps, expeditions, and military cover-ups. Some claimed the poles contained entrances, that Nazi Germany sought it, that Admiral Byrd flew into it, that civilizations far more advanced than ours lived down there, having retreated from the surface after ancient cataclysms. The idea goes something like this. Earth is hollower, at least honeycombed, and, Inside it are cities powered by free energy, illuminated by a central sun, and populated by beings who might be our ancestors. Or our descendants. Or something in between. Skeptics, of course, laugh. Geophysics and seismic readings say no, drilling attempts say no, volcanoes scream no, but the hollow earth theory refuses to die. Why? Maybe because it taps into a primal idea that wisdom lies below, that the underworld isn't always punishment, but preservation, that there are beings hiding in the shadows of our planet who chose exile over extinction, and maybe there's something poetic in imagining that, as we look up to the stars for salvation, the truth lies buried in the silence beneath us. Next, we go from theoretical cities to very real substance, a technological leap too sharp, too early, and too universal to explain by luck. Because when ancient people learned to melt stone and summon metal from rock, they weren't just inventing tools, they were channeling something ancient. And possibly, not entirely their own, the origin of metals. There was a time when metal didn't exist, not in tools, not in weapons, just scattered in veins of ore, hidden within the earth's crust, inert and useless. Then, suddenly, human beings figured out how to mine it, smelt it, purify it, alloy it, and turn it into empires. The Copper Age, then Bronze, then Iron, each leap so dramatic that they now define whole eras of history. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The knowledge of metallurgy seems to appear in multiple places, with striking similarity, often without clear diffusion paths. How did so many ancient civilizations, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Indus Valley, Chinese, Mesoamerican all, figure out how to extract and work metals around the same window of time? How did they know what to heat, how long, and with what combination? Smelting isn't intuitive. You don't just toss rocks in a fire and discover bronze. You need consistent temperature, air control, and chemical understanding. Which begs the question, was this knowledge discovered or remembered? Some scholars argue for cultural diffusion, that traders and migratory peoples passed along these skills, that the presence of copper tools in one valley inspired another. But that doesn't explain the independent rise of metallurgical expertise on different continents, often in isolation. Then come the fringe theories. That metallurgy was a gift from gods, from fallen civilizations, or from something extraterrestrial. That the first smiths were initiates, given divine tools or knowledge to reshape the physical world. After all, every ancient culture links metalworking to myth, Vulcan, Ptah, Hephaestus. The divine blacksmith is a constant. And what about the meteoric iron used before smelting was even known? Weapons made from sky metal, rare, magnetic, and considered sacred. Were these symbolic of something deeper? A memory of when metal fell from the sky? Or came with something else? Maybe the origin of metallurgy wasn't a technological evolution. Maybe it was a rediscovery of what had been lost in a global cataclysm. Because once you teach a species how to work metal, you've given it the power to build cities, to make weapons, to rewrite nature, to conquer the world or destroy it. And perhaps the ancients didn't stumble upon this knowledge. Perhaps they were warned what to do with it. Now, from the forging of elements to the movement of star sway turn to a cosmic pattern, one encoded in myth and monument, calendar and cult, over and over again. A cycle so vast, its clock only ticks once every few thousand years. The Great Year concept. It's not a calendar, it's not a season. It's a cyclia vast, astronomical rhythm spanning approximately 26,000 years. Known today as the precession of the equinoxes, this celestial wobble of the Earth's axis is caused by gravitational forces from the Sun and Moon acting upon the Earth's equatorial bulge. It shifts the position of the equinoxes across the constellations of the zodiac, creating a slow-motion loop through the heavens that takes millennia to complete. And somehow, ancient civilizations seem to know about it. The term Great Year comes from the Greeks, specifically Plato, who referred to it as the perfect year in which all celestial bodies complete their cycles and return to their original positions. But clues to this knowledge go deeper, far deeper than Greece. In Vedic texts, particularly the Yugas, time is divided into massive epochs: Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga, each representing a decline in human consciousness, and each mapped to thousands of years. The full cycle, roughly 24,000 to 26,000 years, depending on interpretation, a suspiciously close match to axial precession. In ancient Egypt, the Dendera Zodiac and various temple alignments suggest awareness of stellar drift, specifically the shift in the position of the constellation Leo over thousands of years. And the Sphinx, allegedly aligned with Leo's rising, adds more fire to that theory. Then there's the Maya. Their long count calendar spans thousands of years, and scholars have debated whether it encodes precessional data. The number 25,920, the number of years in the precession cycle, recurs in sacred numerology around the world, often through harmonic multiples: 72, 2,000, 160, 4,320. Coincidence? Possibly. Or perhaps a memory of an ancient understanding of cosmic time. This knowledge shouldn't exist in pre-scientific cultures. It requires centuries of observation, precise measurement, and patient record-keeping. But more than that, it requires intent. You don't measure what you don't care about. So why did so many ancient civilizations care about this slow, nearly imperceptible wobble? Some argue it was mythologized, because it symbolized the rise and fall of ages. Others think it was tied to lost knowledge of solar cycles, consciousness shifts, or even catastrophic resets. Because precession doesn't just change, the starset changes what they mean. Civilizations tied their myths, calendars, and identities to constellations. When those shifted, so did everything else. Maybe that's why the ancients tried to encode the great year into stone and scripture. They weren't just tracking the heavens, they were warning us that time is circular, that ages rise and fall. That nothing, no matter how golden, lasts forever. And now, as we near the final note in this cosmic dirge, we arrive at the most encompassing mystery of all. Not a place, not a person, but an event, a veil drawn over everything. A story erased in fire and flood. The global cataclysm hypothesis. It's the whisper behind every flood myth, the smoking crater at the center of our collective amnesia. The idea that a global cataclysm, perhaps a series of thermons, reshaped Earth and human history so dramatically that all prior knowledge was wiped clean. Some call it the Younger Dryas impact event. Others frame it through religious apocalypse. Some see rising seas, others fire from the sky. But the common thread is this: around 10,800 BCE something happened. The Younger Dryas was a period of sudden, extreme cooling that interrupted the planet's slow thaw from the last ice age. It lasted over 1,000 years. Species vanished, climates flipped, sea levels surged. And somewhere in that chaos, civilizations, possibly advanced ones, may have disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind only scattered stone and legend. Mainstream science recognizes the event, but it doesn't like the baggage. The idea of global trauma, that a comet or asteroid fragmented and slammed into North America, sending ice and fire across the globe, is controversial. Because if it's true, then every myth about a great flood, every architectural anomaly that predates history, every mystery we've explored in this entire journey starts to make a lot more sense. Suddenly, Gobekli Tepe isn't an outlier, it's a survivor. Atlantis isn't a fairy tale, it's a memory. The abrupt appearance of agriculture, metallurgy, star maps, and pyramids becomes a desperate rebuilding process. a civilization digging itself out of the ashes. Many ancient texts describe a time before the flood. The Bible, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Sumerian king lists, they all speak of a reset, a divine punishment, a purging, or perhaps a planetary correction. The cataclysm theory doesn't just explain what we've lost. It reframes what we think we know, that human history isn't a clean upward slope but a jagged heartbeat. Bursts of brilliance, shattered by chaos, rebuilt with fragments. And maybe that's the greatest mystery of all. That the past isn't behind us, it's beneath us. And that every ruin, every myth, every inexplicable object might be a breadcrumb from a world that was smarter, older, and more fragile than we've ever dared to admit. Because the flood didn't just take cities. It took memory. And all we've been doing since is trying to remember. The end. Or rather, the start of the forgetting.